What would you sacrifice for freedom? Sometimes the greatest acts of courage come with the heaviest price. Subscribe to our channel for more incredible true stories that will move your soul. The summer of 1863 hung heavy over the Whitmore plantation like a suffocating blanket. The air shimmered with heat waves that danced above the cotton fields, where dozens of enslaved souls bent their backs under the merciless Georgia sun. Among them, 12-year-old Caleb moved with the quiet grace of someone who had learned early that invisibility was survival. His small hands, already calloused from years of labor, picked cotton with mechanical precision while his mind wandered to memories of his mother, Sarah. She had been the plantation's seamstress, her gentle fingers creating beautiful garments for the master's family while whispering stories of freedom to her son during stolen moments in the evening. The plantation stretched for miles in every direction, a kingdom of cotton and cruelty ruled by Master Whitmore with an iron fist. The main house stood like a white monument to wealth built on human suffering, its tall columns and wraparound porches a stark contrast to the ramshackle slave quarters that housed nearly 200 souls. Between the big house and the quarters lay the fields, endless rows of cotton that seemed to stretch to the horizon, broken only by the occasional oak tree that provided precious moments of shade during the scorching summer days. Caleb had been born on this plantation, as had his mother before him. His earliest memories were of her gentle hands braiding his hair while she hummed spirituals in their tiny cabin. She would tell him stories of Africa passed down through generations, of a land where people with skin like theirs lived as kings and queens, where children played freely under vast skies without fear of the overseer's whip. "Remember, Caleb," she would say, her voice barely above a whisper as they sat in their cramped quarters. "Freedom isn't just about breaking chains. It's about having the courage to help others break theirs too." Those words echoed in his mind now as he watched the overseer, Mr. Briggs, crack his whip near a group of field workers. The man's cruel laughter sent shivers down Caleb's spine, reminding him of the day everything changed. Briggs was a tall, lean man with cold blue eyes and a perpetual sneer that seemed carved into his weathered face. He took pleasure in the suffering of others, finding creative ways to inflict pain and humiliation on those under his control. It had been 3 weeks since his mother was sold to a plantation in Alabama. The reason? She had stepped between Caleb and Briggs' whip when the overseer decided the boy wasn't working fast enough. Her defiant stance, her protective embrace, and her fierce words had sealed her fate. The memory of that day burned in Caleb's mind like a brand. He had been struggling with a particularly heavy basket of cotton, his small frame no match for the weight. Briggs had appeared suddenly, his whip already raised, his face twisted with sadistic pleasure. "Boy's getting lazy," Briggs had snarled. "Time to teach him what happens to lazy slaves." But before the whip could fall, Sarah had thrown herself between them, her arms wrapping protectively around her son. "You touch my boy again, and I'll make sure Master Whitmore knows exactly what kind of man he's got watching over his property," she had said, her voice steady despite the danger. Briggs had smiled coldly, his eyes glittering with malice. "We'll see about that, Sarah. We'll see." The punishment had been swift and brutal. Within a week she was gone, sold like livestock, torn from her son's arms as he screamed her name. The last image Caleb had of his mother was her tear-streaked face looking back at him from the wagon that carried her away, her lips forming the words, "Be brave, my love." The days following her departure had been the darkest of Caleb's young life. He moved through his duties like a ghost, barely eating, barely sleeping. The other enslaved people tried to comfort him, but their own grief and fear made it difficult to offer much solace. Aunt Celia, an elderly woman who had known his mother since childhood, would sometimes slip him extra cornbread or a piece of fruit. But even her kindness couldn't fill the gaping hole left by his mother's absence. Now, as Independence Day approached and the white folks prepared their celebrations of freedom, Caleb felt the bitter irony burning in his chest. How could they celebrate liberty while keeping human beings in chains? The hypocrisy was so stark, so obvious, that it made him physically ill to watch the preparations. The plantation buzzed with activity as preparations for the holiday began. Master Whitmore had invited neighboring plantation owners for a grand celebration, complete with fireworks and speeches about the glory of American independence. The enslaved people would be expected to serve, smile, and pretend to share in the joy of a freedom they would never taste. Caleb watched as house slaves polished silver and crystal, their movements careful and precise under the watchful eye of the head house slave, a stern woman named Minerva, who had learned that survival meant absolute perfection in service. Kitchen slaves worked from dawn to dusk, preparing elaborate dishes, roasted meats, delicate pastries, and fine wines that cost more than most enslaved people would see in a lifetime. That evening, as Caleb returned from the fields, he noticed something different. The usual guards around the holding barn, where newly arrived or troublesome enslaved people were kept, seemed fewer than normal. Most of the overseers were busy preparing for tomorrow's festivities, their attention focused on impressing the guests rather than maintaining their usual vigilance. The holding barn stood like a monument to human cruelty, its thick wooden walls containing nearly 30 souls who had either just arrived at the plantation or were being punished for various infractions. Caleb had heard their muffled cries and prayers during sleepless nights, each sound a reminder of the hell they all lived in. The structure was deliberately placed where the sounds of suffering would serve as a warning to others, close enough to the quarters that everyone could hear, but far enough from the big house that the master's comfort wouldn't be disturbed. As he passed by the barn on his way to the slave quarters, he heard a familiar voice. Old Moses, a man who'd been on the plantation longer than anyone could remember. Moses was telling the others about the Underground Railroad, about brave souls who risked everything to help people escape to freedom. "There's a network," Moses whispered through the wooden slats, his voice carrying the weight of hard-earned wisdom. "People who believe that no human being should own another. They leave signs, create safe houses, guide folks north to freedom. I've seen it with my own eyes, children, seen people disappear in the night and find their way to places where they can walk free." Caleb pressed closer to the wall, his heart racing. He had heard whispers of such things before, but never from someone who seemed to know so much detail. Moses had been a house slave in his younger years, privy to conversations and information that field hands rarely accessed. "The North Star," Moses continued, his voice filled with reverence. "That's our guide. Follow it north, and you'll find people willing to help. Quakers mostly, and some freed slaves who've made it to safety. They risked their own lives to help others find freedom. But it takes courage, children. More courage than most folks can muster." As Caleb listened, his mother's words echoed in his mind. Freedom isn't just about breaking chains. It's about having the courage to help others break theirs too. That night, lying on his thin straw mattress in the cabin he now shared with 3 other field hands, Caleb stared through the crack in the wall at the stars above. The North Star seemed to wink at him, as if calling him to action. He thought about his mother, probably looking at the same stars from some distant plantation, wondering if she would ever see her son again. The idea came to him slowly, like dawn breaking over the horizon. Tomorrow, while the white folks celebrated their independence, he could give real independence to the people trapped in that barn. He could be the courage his mother had spoken of. He could honor her memory by living up to the values she had instilled in him. But the weight of such a decision pressed down on him like a physical force. If he was caught, he would face a fate worse than being sold away. He would face death, and not a quick one. Master Whitmore was known for making examples of those who defied him, and the punishments were designed to be both brutal and public, serving as warnings to others who might harbor similar thoughts of rebellion. Yet, as he looked at the North Star, he felt his mother's presence, her strength flowing through him like warm honey. He could almost hear her voice, gentle but firm, reminding him that some things were worth any risk, that the freedom of others was worth his own life. "Be brave, my love," he whispered to himself, echoing her last words to him. The decision was made. Tomorrow, on Independence Day, Caleb would give the gift of true freedom to 30 souls. He just prayed that somehow, some way, it would also lead him back to his mother, though deep in his heart, a growing fear whispered that he might never see her again. The morning of July 4th, 1863, dawned with a crimson sky that seemed to foreshadow the day's events. Caleb woke before the plantation bell rang, his stomach churning with a mixture of fear and determination. Today he would either become a hero or die trying. The plantation was already bustling with activity despite the early hour. Kitchen slaves hurried to prepare the feast for Master Whitmore's guests, while house slaves polished silver and arranged flowers with the precision of soldiers preparing for battle. The air was thick with the smell of roasting pig and fresh bread, a stark contrast to the meager portions the enslaved people would receive, thin gruel and whatever scraps might be left after the celebration. Caleb moved through his morning chores with mechanical precision, his mind focused entirely on the plan forming in his head. He had spent the sleepless night memorizing every detail of the barn's layout, every guard rotation, every possible escape route. The plantation had become a map in his mind, each building, each path, each hiding place catalogued and analyzed for its potential usefulness. The holding barn sat at the edge of the plantation, strategically positioned to serve multiple purposes. It was close enough to the main house to be monitored, but far enough away that the screams of the punished wouldn't disturb the master's sleep. The structure itself was a testament to the calculated cruelty of slavery, built not just to contain, but to break spirits. It was a wooden structure with thick walls and a single heavy door secured with an iron bar. 2 small windows near the roof provided the only ventilation, making the interior stifling in the summer heat and freezing in winter. During his morning water rounds, a task that took him near various buildings across the plantation, Caleb managed to get close enough to the barn to hear the voices inside. There were families in there, mothers with children, elderly people who had committed the crime of being too slow in the fields, and young men whose spirits hadn't yet been broken by the systematic brutality of plantation life. "Mama, I'm scared," he heard a small voice say, the words carrying clearly through the wooden slats. "Hush now, baby," came the gentle reply, filled with a love that no amount of cruelty could extinguish. "We're going to be okay. Somehow we're going to be okay." The exchange reminded Caleb so powerfully of conversations with his own mother that tears sprang to his eyes. These people deserved freedom. They deserved to see their children grow up without chains, to make their own choices about where to live and how to spend their days. They deserved to love without fear of separation, to dream without the crushing weight of hopelessness. Among the voices, he recognized several people. There was Ruth, a young mother who had been locked up for refusing to let the master's son touch her inappropriately. Her infant son was with her, and Caleb could hear the baby's soft cries mixing with his mother's whispered lullabies. There was Samuel, an elderly man whose crime had been teaching other enslaved people to read, a skill that Master Whitmore considered dangerous and subversive. And there was Mary, a teenager who had been caught trying to visit her mother on a neighboring plantation without permission. As the day progressed, Caleb observed the guard patterns more carefully than ever before. During the afternoon, when the celebration was in full swing, only one guard remained near the barn, Old Pete, a man whose loyalty to Master Whitmore was matched only by his love for corn whiskey. Pete was a relic from an earlier era, a poor white man who had found his only sense of superiority in his position over enslaved people. He was cruel when sober and careless when drunk, making him both dangerous and potentially useful. Caleb had noticed that Pete often indulged heavily during plantation celebrations, becoming drowsy and inattentive as the evening wore on. The man would position himself under a large oak tree near the barn, where he could theoretically watch the entrance while enjoying whatever liquor he could procure from the festivities. The plan was simple but dangerous. During the height of the evening festivities, when the fireworks began and all attention was focused on the celebration, Caleb would approach the barn. If Pete was drunk enough, Caleb might be able to get the keys without confrontation. If not, well, he would figure that out when the time came. He had considered various scenarios, creating a distraction, waiting for Pete to fall asleep, even the possibility of overpowering the man, if necessary, though at 12 years old and barely 80 pounds, that seemed unlikely to succeed. But first, he needed to prepare the people inside for what was about to happen. During his afternoon chores, which included distributing water to various work crews, Caleb managed to get close enough to the barn to whisper through the wooden slats. "Listen to me," he said urgently, his voice barely audible above the sounds of preparation happening around the plantation. "Tonight, when the fireworks start, I'm going to get you out of here." There was a moment of stunned silence before old Moses' voice responded, filled with disbelief and concern. "Boy, what are you talking about? You can't—" "I can, and I will," Caleb interrupted, his voice carrying a determination that surprised even himself. "When I open that door, you need to be ready to run. Head north, follow the North Star. There are people who will help you. I heard you talking about the Underground Railroad. It's real and it's your chance." "Child," came a woman's voice. "Ruth," he thought. "If they catch you doing this, they'll kill you, and not quick neither. They'll make it slow and painful, make sure everyone sees what happens to folks who try to help us." Caleb's throat tightened with emotion. He knew she was right. The punishment for helping enslaved people escape was death, and Master Whitmore would make sure it was a death that served as a warning to others. But the knowledge didn't change his resolve. "My mama always told me that freedom isn't just about breaking your own chains. It's about helping others break theirs, too. She's gone now, sold away because she tried to protect me. This is what she would want me to do. This is how I honor her memory." The silence that followed was heavy with emotion. Finally, Moses spoke again, his voice thick with feeling. "What's your name, boy?" "Caleb." "Well, Caleb, if you're determined to do this fool thing, then we'll be ready. But you listen to me. Once you open that door, you run too. You hear me? Don't you stay behind for nothing or nobody. Your mama didn't sacrifice herself so you could throw your life away." As evening approached, the plantation transformed into a festival of lights and sounds that seemed to mock the very concept of freedom. Lanterns hung from trees like captured fireflies. Tables groaned under the weight of food that represented more wealth than most enslaved people would see in a lifetime. And the master's guests arrived in their finest clothes, laughing and toasting to American independence while being served by the very people they kept in bondage. The guests were a collection of neighboring plantation owners, local politicians, and wealthy merchants who had built their fortunes on the backs of enslaved labor. They spoke eloquently about liberty and justice, while their own actions made a mockery of those very principles. Caleb watched from the shadows as they danced and celebrated, their joy feeling obscene to him, a mockery of the word freedom when so many remained in chains. The irony was not lost on him that these people would spend the evening celebrating their independence from British rule while denying basic human rights to hundreds of people on their own properties. They would make speeches about the inalienable rights of man while treating human beings as property to be bought and sold. But their distraction was exactly what he needed. As the celebration reached its peak, with music and laughter filling the air, Caleb knew that all eyes would be focused on the festivities. The guards would be relaxed, the overseers would be drinking, and the attention of everyone in authority would be directed away from the holding barn. As darkness fell, the fireworks began. Brilliant explosions of red, white, and blue lit up the sky, each burst accompanied by cheers and applause from the celebrating crowd. The noise was perfect cover for what Caleb was about to do. The explosions would mask any sounds he might make, and the bright flashes would temporarily blind anyone who might be watching. He made his way toward the barn, his heart pounding so hard he was sure everyone could hear it. Each step felt like it took an eternity, and every shadow seemed to hide potential discovery. Old Pete sat slumped against the oak tree near the barn door, a jug of whiskey cradled in his arms like a beloved child. His eyes were closed, and soft snores escaped his lips, mixing with the distant sounds of celebration. Caleb approached carefully, each step deliberate and silent. He had learned to move quietly during his years on the plantation. It was a survival skill that all enslaved children developed early. The keys hung from Pete's belt, glinting in the moonlight like a promise of freedom. As another firework exploded overhead, casting everything in brilliant light for a moment, Caleb reached out with trembling fingers and carefully lifted the key ring from the guard's belt. Pete stirred slightly, mumbling something incoherent about the war and Yankees, but didn't wake. Caleb held his breath, waiting for what felt like an eternity before the man's breathing returned to its steady rhythm. The smell of whiskey was so strong it was almost overwhelming, and Caleb realized that Pete was far more intoxicated than he had dared to hope. With the keys in his hand, Caleb approached the barn door. The iron bar was heavy, much heavier than he had anticipated, but adrenaline gave him strength he didn't know he possessed. As he lifted it away from the door, the metal scraped against wood with a sound that seemed deafeningly loud to his ears, though it was probably no louder than a whisper. Inside the barn, he could hear movement, people getting ready, gathering what few possessions they had, preparing for the run of their lives. He could hear whispered prayers and quiet sobs, the sounds of people who had given up hope suddenly finding it again. Caleb pulled the door open, and 30 pairs of eyes stared back at him in the darkness. For a moment, nobody moved. The reality of the moment seemed too incredible to believe. Then Moses stepped forward, his weathered face creased with emotion, tears streaming down his cheeks. "God bless you, child," he whispered, his voice breaking with emotion. "God bless you and keep you safe." The barn door swung open like the gates of heaven, and for a moment, the 30 souls inside could only stare in disbelief. Freedom stood before them in the form of a 12-year-old boy, whose courage far exceeded his years, whose small frame seemed to glow with an inner light that made him appear larger than life. "Go," Caleb whispered urgently, his voice carrying across the cramped space like a prayer answered. "Follow the North Star, stay together, help each other, and don't look back. There are people who will help you, Quakers and freed slaves who know the way. Trust in God and trust in each other." Just the first to emerge was Ruth, the young mother clutching her infant son to her chest. Her eyes were wide with a mixture of hope and terror, the same expression worn by someone standing at the edge of a cliff, knowing they must jump, but unsure if they would survive the fall. Behind her came Samuel, the elderly man who had been locked up for the crime of teaching other enslaved people to read. His hands shook as he stepped into the night air, not from fear, but from the overwhelming emotion of breathing free air for the first time in months. Then came the others, families clutching each other's hands, individuals who had lost everything but their will to survive, young and old, all united by their shared dream of freedom and their shared gratitude to the boy who was making it possible. There was James, a blacksmith whose powerful hands had been chained because he had dared to forge tools for other enslaved people to use in escape attempts. There was Lily, a house slave who had been imprisoned for refusing to spy on her fellow slaves for the master. Each person carried their own story of suffering, their own reasons for being in that barn. But tonight they shared a single story, the story of liberation. Among them was a family that particularly caught Caleb's attention. A mother named Grace with her 2 young daughters, twins who couldn't have been more than 6 years old. The girls clung to their mother's skirts, their eyes wide with confusion and fear. They had been born into slavery and had never known anything else. The concept of freedom was as foreign to them as the idea of flying. "Where are we going, Mama?" one of the twins whispered. Grace knelt down and gathered her daughters close. "We're going to a place where you can play in the sunshine without fear, where you can learn to read and write, where no one will ever own you again." Moses was among the last to emerge, his hand briefly touching Caleb's shoulder with a gentleness that spoke of deep respect and profound gratitude. "You coming with us, boy?" Caleb looked back toward the plantation, where the fireworks continued to light up the sky in brilliant displays of red, white, and blue. Somewhere out there, beyond the celebration, beyond the fields of cotton and chains, was his mother. The hope that had sustained him for weeks, the belief that she was alive and waiting for him somewhere in Alabama, still burned in his chest like a flame that refused to be extinguished. "I can't," he said quietly, his voice barely audible above the distant sounds of celebration. "Not yet. I have to find her. I have to try." "Child, you can't save everyone," Moses said gently, his weathered hand still resting on Caleb's shoulder. "Sometimes you have to save yourself first. Your mama, she'd want you to live. She'd want you to be free." But Caleb shook his head, his young face set with a determination that reminded Moses of Sarah herself. "She's all I have left. I have to try. Even if it kills me, I have to try." Moses nodded, understanding the boy's pain in a way that only someone who had lost everything could understand. "Then may God watch over you, Caleb, and may he help you find your way to her, whether in this world or the next." As the group began to move away from the barn, Caleb watched them disappear into the darkness one by one, each figure representing a life saved, a family reunited with hope, a soul freed from bondage. Ruth turned back once, her baby sleeping peacefully in her arms, and mouthed, "Thank you," before vanishing into the night. Samuel raised his hand in a silent blessing, his lips moving in what Caleb assumed was a prayer for the boy's safety. The twins waved shyly before their mother hurried them along, and James, the blacksmith, paused to clasp Caleb's hand briefly, his grip conveying more gratitude than words ever could. Others simply ran, their bare feet silent on the earth as they headed toward the tree line that would provide cover for their journey north. Some carried small bundles of possessions, a treasured photograph, a piece of jewelry hidden for years, a letter from a loved one. Others carried nothing but the clothes on their backs and the hope in their hearts. The sight filled Caleb with a bittersweet joy that was almost overwhelming. These people were free now, truly free for the first time in their lives. Children would grow up without masters. Families would stay together by choice rather than by the whim of an owner. And dreams that had been crushed under the weight of bondage could finally take flight. The knowledge that he had made this possible, that his courage had given 30 people the chance at real life, filled him with a pride that was tempered by the growing certainty that he would pay a terrible price for his actions. But as the last figure disappeared into the darkness, the reality of what he had done began to sink in with crushing weight. In a few hours, when the celebration ended and the guards checked the barn, his act of defiance would be discovered. There would be consequences. Terrible, violent consequences that would serve as a warning to anyone else who might harbor thoughts of rebellion. Caleb carefully replaced the iron bar across the door, his hands shaking now that the adrenaline was beginning to fade. He returned the keys to old Pete's belt, the guard still unconscious and reeking of whiskey. With any luck, it would be morning before anyone realized what had happened, giving the escapees precious hours to put distance between themselves and the plantation. As he made his way back to the slave quarters, Caleb's mind raced with possibilities and fears. Maybe he could claim ignorance, say he had seen nothing unusual during the night. Maybe he could run away himself, try to catch up with the group he had just freed and seek safety in numbers. But deep in his heart, he knew neither option felt right or even possible. His mother was out there somewhere, probably on a plantation just as cruel as this one, probably wondering if her son was still alive, probably praying every night for his safety and freedom. If he ran now, he might never find her. If he stayed and was caught, he might never get the chance to look for her. It was an impossible choice, but it was his to make, and he had already made it the moment he decided to free the others. The slave quarters were quiet when he returned, most of the inhabitants either asleep or pretending to be. A few people stirred as he passed, but no one questioned his late return. Night wanderings were not uncommon among the enslaved population. Sometimes people needed to walk off their despair. Sometimes they met in secret to pray or share news. Sometimes they simply needed to feel like they had some control over their own movements, even if it was just for a few minutes in the darkness. Caleb lay on his straw mattress, listening to the sounds of the celebration winding down. Gradually the laughter faded, the music stopped, and the plantation settled into an uneasy quiet. He dozed fitfully, his dreams filled with images of his mother's face and the grateful eyes of the people he had freed. In his dreams, he saw them reaching the north, finding safety and new lives, raising their children in freedom. In his dreams, he found his mother, and they were reunited in a place where no one could ever separate them again. But even in sleep, a part of him knew that dreams and reality were very different things, and that the morning would bring consequences he might not survive. Dawn came too soon, announced by the plantation bell that had regulated his life for as long as he could remember. The sound that had once been merely the marker of another day of labor now seemed ominous, like a funeral bell tolling for his own fate. Caleb rose with the others, his stomach churning with anxiety and a strange sense of peace. Whatever happened now, he had done something meaningful with his life. He had honored his mother's memory and her teachings. He had chosen courage over safety, love over self-preservation. The discovery came just after breakfast, as Caleb had known it would. A house slave named Jenny was supposed to bring water to the people in the holding barn, a daily ritual that served both practical and psychological purposes. It kept the prisoners alive while reminding them of their complete dependence on their captor's mercy. When Jenny arrived at the barn and found it empty, her screams of shock and confusion brought the overseers running from all directions. The sound echoed across the plantation like the cry of a wounded animal, and Caleb felt his heart stop as he realized there was no going back now. 3 days passed in agonizing suspense, each hour stretching like an eternity as the plantation transformed into a fortress under siege. The atmosphere was thick with paranoia and rage, every shadow suspect, every whispered conversation potentially treasonous. Master Whitmore had brought in slave catchers with their vicious dogs, and the sound of baying hounds echoed across the countryside as they searched for the escaped people, their howls mixing with the screams of other enslaved people who were subjected to brutal interrogations. The plantation felt like a powder keg ready to explode, with everyone watching everyone else, suspicion thick in the air like humidity before a storm. Overseers moved through the quarters at all hours, their eyes cold and calculating as they searched for any sign of guilt or knowledge. Random beatings became more frequent, as if violence itself could extract the truth from unwilling lips. Caleb went through the motions of his daily routine, but inside, he was dying a slow death of anxiety. Every glance from an overseer, every whispered conversation that stopped when he approached, every unexpected summons made his heart race with terror. He had expected to be caught immediately, but the delay was almost worse than discovery would have been. The waiting, the constant fear, the knowledge that his fate was sealed but not yet delivered. It was a special kind of torture. During those 3 days, the plantation became a place of systematic brutality as Master Whitmore and his overseers tried to extract information about the escape. Enslaved people were pulled from their work randomly and subjected to interrogations that often involved whips, hot irons, and other instruments of torture. The screams that echoed from the punishment shed served as a constant reminder of what awaited anyone suspected of involvement in the escape. Caleb watched in horror as people he had known his entire life were brutalized for information they didn't possess. Old Martha, who had helped raise him after his mother was sold, was beaten unconscious for the crime of being seen near the barn 2 days before the escape. Young Timothy, barely older than Caleb himself, had his fingers broken one by one as Briggs demanded to know what he had heard about escape plans. The cruelty was not random, but calculated, designed to break the spirit of the entire enslaved community and ensure that such an act of defiance would never happen again. Master Whitmore wanted everyone to understand that the price of rebellion was not just death, but prolonged suffering that would serve as a warning to future generations. On the 3rd night, as he lay sleepless on his straw mattress, Caleb heard footsteps approaching the slave quarters, heavy boots on wooden planks, moving with purpose and stealth. The sound sent ice through his veins, and he closed his eyes and pretended to sleep, but every muscle in his body was tense, ready to run, even though he knew there was nowhere to go. "Caleb," a voice called softly. "Caleb, wake up." He opened his eyes to find Thomas standing over him, his face barely visible in the moonlight, streaming through the cracks in the wall. Thomas was Moses's nephew, a young man in his 20s who worked as a stable hand and had a reputation for being both intelligent and careful. Around them, other enslaved people stirred restlessly, but no one else woke. Or if they did, they were wise enough to pretend otherwise. "Come with me," Thomas whispered, his voice urgent but controlled. "We need to talk." Caleb's mouth went dry as cotton. This was it. Thomas was going to turn him in for the reward money. He considered running, but where could he go? The plantation was surrounded by slave catchers and their dogs, and the countryside was hostile to anyone with dark skin who couldn't prove they belonged to a specific master. There was nowhere to hide, nowhere to run. Reluctantly, he followed Thomas outside, away from the quarters, and toward the edge of the cotton fields. The night was warm and humid, filled with the sound of crickets and the distant howling of search dogs that continued their relentless hunt for the escaped slaves. The moon was nearly full, casting everything in silver light that made the familiar landscape look alien and threatening. "I know what you did," Thomas said when they were far enough from the quarters that no one could overhear them. Caleb's heart stopped, then began beating so fast he thought it might burst from his chest. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't lie to me, boy. I saw you near the barn that night. I was coming back from the celebration when I saw you with the keys." Thomas's voice was calm, matter-of-fact, which somehow made it more terrifying than if he had been angry or accusatory. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Caleb waited for Thomas to demand the reward money, to threaten to turn him in unless he got a share of some imaginary profit, to reveal whatever scheme had brought him here in the middle of the night. Instead, Thomas did something unexpected. He smiled, his teeth white in the moonlight. "You got some serious courage, little brother," he said quietly. his voice filled with admiration rather than condemnation. "More courage than most grown men I know, more courage than I've got, that's for sure." Caleb stared at him in confusion, unable to process what he was hearing. "You're not going to turn me in?" Thomas laughed softly, but there was no humor in the sound, only a deep sadness and a kind of weary respect. "Turn you in? Boy, I want to shake your hand. You did something I've been dreaming about doing for years. You gave those people a chance at real life, a chance to be human beings instead of property." Relief flooded through Caleb so powerfully that his knees nearly buckled. For 3 days, he had been carrying the weight of his secret alone, expecting discovery and death at any moment. To find an ally, someone who understood and approved of what he had done, was almost overwhelming. "Then why did you bring me out here?" Caleb asked, his voice shaking with emotion. Thomas's expression grew serious, the smile fading from his face like clouds covering the moon. "Because Briggs is getting close. He's been asking questions, putting pieces together like a puzzle. He knows it had to be someone small enough to move quietly, someone who knew the plantation well enough to avoid the other guards, someone with access to the areas around the barn. He's narrowing it down, and your name is on his list." The fear returned, cold and sharp as a blade. "What should I do?" "You need to run," Thomas said urgently, his hands gripping Caleb's shoulders. "Tonight. Right now, I can help you get to the tree line, give you a head start before they realize you're gone. I've got some food hidden away, and I know the patrol routes. We can get you out of here." But Caleb shook his head, the motion automatic and immediate. "I can't. My mother is out there somewhere. If I run now, I'll never find her." Thomas's grip tightened, his eyes intense in the moonlight. "Listen to me, boy. Your mama is gone. She could be anywhere in Alabama, or they could have sold her again to somewhere even farther away. You could spend your whole life looking for her and never find her. The South is a big place, and slave records aren't exactly reliable." "But I have to try," Caleb said, tears starting to flow down his cheeks. "She's all I have left. She protected me, and I couldn't protect her. The least I can do is try to find her, try to save her like she saved me." Thomas was quiet for a moment, studying Caleb's face in the moonlight, seeing the determination and love that no amount of fear could shake. Finally, he sighed deeply, his shoulders sagging with the weight of what he was about to reveal. "You're just like your mama, you know that. Stubborn as a mule and twice as brave. She never would back down from what she thought was right, no matter what it cost her. You knew her well." "Course I knew her. Sarah was the strongest woman on this plantation, maybe the strongest person, period. She never let them break her spirit, no matter what they did to her, and she loved you more than life itself. Used to talk about you all the time, about how proud she was of you, about how she was going to make sure you grew up to be a good man." Thomas paused, seeming to wrestle with some internal decision, his face a mask of pain and reluctance. Then he continued, his voice heavy with sorrow. "She made me promise something before they took her away. Made me swear that if anything happened to you, I'd look out for you, protect you if I could. Well, something's about to happen to you, and I aim to keep my promise to her." Before Caleb could ask what he meant, they heard the sound of approaching footsteps. Multiple sets of boots, moving fast across the plantation grounds, accompanied by the excited barking of dogs who had picked up a scent. Thomas cursed under his breath, his head turning toward the sound. "They're coming for you now," he whispered urgently, his voice filled with desperation. "Change of plans. We run together right now. I'm not leaving you to face this alone." But it was too late. Torches appeared in the distance, moving toward them like angry fireflies, their light growing brighter with each passing second. The slave catchers had been alerted, and they were closing in fast, their dogs straining against their leashes as they followed the scent trail. "This way," Thomas said, grabbing Caleb's hand and pulling him toward the cotton fields. "We can lose them in the rows, maybe make it to the swamp if we're lucky." They ran through the tall cotton plants, the leaves rustling around them like whispered prayers, the bolls catching at their clothes as they pushed through the dense growth. Behind them, the torches grew brighter, and they could hear voices shouting orders, dogs barking with excitement as they picked up the scent and began to close the distance. "There!" someone yelled, the voice carrying clearly across the field.